Okay, then there's the big problem. The big problem meaning here that there's something that's really painful to somebody out there that they're willing to spend money on to get solved. Okay? In the case of TrafAx, for example, everybody hates sitting in traffic. If you were able to know what the best route to get to where you wanted to go and avoid all the traffic jams, right? That would be something that would be, I think that most people would want to be a part of. That's a big problem. There's also growing market, right? You don't want to address, you don't want to be saying that you're addressing a problem that's shrinking, right? That's eventually going to disappear, right? You want to be able to find a problem that's growing. That makes sales easier. You're not displacing existing competition necessarily, but you can just simply add customers as the market itself grows. It's much easier for a small company that's just starting out to sell into growing markets as opposed to shrinking or static ones. And then the world-class team. I know most of the people who are entering the business plan competition are students, and you still haven't established your credentials, and hard to claim to be a world-class team. But what you can do is try to build up a credible team with a broad range of skill sets that are necessary to make a company successful, as well as having some depth in each of those areas too. And that's what you want to present in your introduction. If that's your most compelling, that's the most compelling aspect of what you're trying to do. And then the last one is the executable strategy. And I put that word executable in there on purpose. And what I mean by that, it's not just a strategy, but something that is executable, something that is realistic and that makes sense, right? If your strategy says, yeah, I'm going to partner up with Microsoft, they're going to give us $1 million because we're so great, et cetera, and you don't have, your uncle's not Bill Gates, or you don't have those kind of connections, then it makes it seem a little bit less credible, or a lot less credible, right? You need to have an executable strategy. So if you've got any of these things, that's what you want to try to put in your introduction, to try to show that, to try to grab the attention of the reader so that they believe that you're going to be successful and they want to read more about what you're doing. Yep.
I'm not very clear about the executable strategy. Can you just explain a bit more about it?
Okay, so let's say that, say you're a software, let's use the example that I was talking about. You're a software company, and part of your strategy, part of your success relies on being able to successfully work with Microsoft, right? If you can say that you've got some kind of relationship with Microsoft that's pre-existing, you know Bill Gates, or you've worked at Microsoft before, so you have those relationships, or something like that, you can mention that in your introduction to show that, yes, I have an executable strategy, right? As opposed to saying, if you don't have those relationships, you probably don't want to emphasize that. You may address how you're dealing with it later on, but that's not going to be one of the key things that you're going to talk about in the introduction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. The next section you want to have after you've grabbed the reader's attention and convinced them that you've got that world-class team, et cetera, whatever it is you're trying to say, then you want to set the context for your value proposition. Right? You want to explain what the market pain is that you address, and why would someone pay you money for your solution. Okay? So in the case of TrafAx, it's the traffic jam. In the case of Recensus, it's bridges collapsing. I don't know if you guys remember, I think it was a couple years ago, the bridge that collapsed in Minnesota, where, I don't know, a dozen people or so died. The building itself was, I think, over $200 million to try to rebuild, et cetera. With the value proposition here is enabling state highway administrations, federal government, et cetera, to have known ahead of time that that bridge was in danger of collapsing, and either shoring it up, renovating it, or evacuating it in time to save those kinds of lives. So that's the pain point there. That those companies are addressing, and that they talked about in their executive summaries. And then, why would someone pay you money for your solution? Well, the traffic jam, it's obvious. You want to avoid sitting in traffic. You want to avoid people dying. Now, when you're writing your problem statement, I think it's really important to remember to keep it concise and keep it simple. I've seen a lot of executive summaries where half the executive summary is about the problem, and then you've gone through a whole page before you even know what the solution is or what the company's trying to do. So you want to avoid that. You just want to keep it to just a few short sentences, just at the most a paragraph. And then keep it simple. You don't have to go into all these crazy statistics or anything, but just pick out the things that will draw the most attention. Okay, any questions about the problem statement? Okay, and then the solution, you want to describe your offering and how it solves the problem. Okay, again, don't get deeply into the technology here. Just keep it simple. Explain what the solution is. In the case of Trafax, for example, what they did was they developed a Bluetooth monitoring system that would detect people's Bluetooth devices as they drove by. And then they would measure it 2 miles down the road and see how long it took to get from one point to the other, right? And because pretty much nowadays everyone has a Bluetooth telephone or a PDA, or even cars have Bluetooth devices in them now, you get a lot of data points about how people are traveling, right? So this is their solution. It's a very simple, elegant solution, and you can explain it pretty quickly, like I just did in just a few sentences. They don't need to go into how they're checking MAC addresses. They don't have to go into how they're doing this or that, that kind of detail. You just have to give the overall solution. You also want to identify who will be using it and who will be paying for it, right? So just identifying the solution is not enough. You want to start getting into who's going to use it. In the case of Trafax, right, who's using it? Well, it's the guys who are the commuters are going to be actually using it. But they're not necessarily the ones who are going to be paying for it. You may have the state highway administrations who are interested in actually buying it and distributing it to commuters. Or it may be state highway planning agencies who want to make sure that they've built enough highways and they understand where the bottlenecks are, etc. So it's not enough just to know what the solution does, but also who would be interested in buying it. Now, one important note is that you should make sure that any intellectual property is secure before you submit anything publicly, right? Because once you talk about something publicly that's potentially patentable, then the clock starts ticking on when you can file that patent. And if somebody hears that and files a patent based on your idea before you, then you're in trouble, right? So make sure that you secure your IP, whether that means if you're a researcher here at the university or a professor, you want to talk to the Office of Technology Commercialization and file a disclosure. If you're an undergraduate student, you just want to try to file a provisional patent before submitting something. Okay. Any questions so far? So the problem and the solution introduction, those are really the most important parts of the executive summary that are going to grab someone's attention. Remember, these judges are reading about maybe 100 of these. They're going to do it in just a couple days. So even getting them past the first few paragraphs might be a challenge, right? So you want to really try to get their attention in these first three sections.